Good afternoon and Happy New Year to everyone. And I want to take this moment to welcome you all to the first Mexico Institute event of 2024. This is, of course, a big year for elections, including those in Mexico and the United States, and in fact, in many places around the world. Analysts in both the US and Mexico are using phrases like most consequential or most important to frame or describe the elections here in the US and in Mexico. So this will no doubt be an intense year in both countries and for the bilateral relationship. Our societies and many others around the world are increasingly polarized and more inclined to question the legitimacy and value of democracy and democratic elections. So the urgency with which people speak about these elections is not entirely hyperbolic. It makes sense, therefore, that we start our 2024 programming by inaugurating our elections webinar series this afternoon. Subsequent webinars that we have planned will focus on discrete policy issues, but today's launch event, we've asked our panelists to frame the election in broader terms. For example, what issues may drive voter preferences? What does the polling data say about the depth and strength of support for the presidential candidates and their parties? What role will be played and what will be the impact of the Movimiento Ciudadano, and whether the undecideds or less certain voters comprise a large enough share of the electorate to change the current projections and predictions. Ultimately, we hope that this conversation will provide all of us with a better understanding of what we should be looking for over the next 4.5 months between now and June 2nd. Our distinguished panel includes Verónica Ortiz, political analyst, El Heraldo de Mexico and Canal del Congreso; Carlos Bravo Regidor, political analyst and independent consultant; Jorge Buendía, director of Buendía y Márquez and a Mexico Institute Global Fellow; and Alejandro Moreno, a professor of political science at ITAM, the director of public opinion polling for El Financiero, and a Mexico Institute Global Fellow as well. Each of our panelists will make about 5 minutes of opening remarks this afternoon, followed by a discussion among them and an opportunity for those of you in the audience to pose questions. If you'd like to submit a question, you can do so either by emailing it to mexico@wilsoncenter.org or tag us on X, formerly known as Twitter, @Mexico Institute. So with that, I'm going to kick things off. We're going to ask Verónica Ortiz to start. Verónica, maybe you could just sort of give us a sense of why these elections are so important for Mexico and why they should matter to US-based policymakers.
Of course, thank you, Andrew. Let me start by wishing everyone a Happy New Year, thanking the Mexico Institute, Andrew Rudman, for this invitation, and I'm very glad and honored to share this panel with Carlos, Jorge, and Alejandro. You talked about the most consequential elections, and I think that applies to many parts in the world. We have actually this year an electoral marathon and have the globe's population, roughly half the globe's population will be voting somewhere and along the year. But for us in Mexico, it is the most consequential election, as I see it, in the last 27 years or so. And this is a historic election, not only because of the size of the election. We have roughly 98 million voters summoned to the polls. And we are going to elect, of course, the president, the next president of Mexico, but also the federal Congress, that is the Senate, the House of Representatives. Will have 9 states that have the governor's position in dispute. And we have also the state legislators to be elected in 31 out of 32 states in Mexico, and also municipalities or cities in 30 entities. And the governorships in dispute include very important states like Jalisco and even Mexico City, and other like southeast entities like Chiapas and Tabasco, Veracruz, Yucatan. So we have a large number of public positions in play, in dispute, and this is for that reason only the largest election in history in democratic Mexico. And so that itself speaks about the importance. But as you asked, let me frame this election in sort of like the larger picture and why we're calling this, at least some analysts are calling this like the most consequential election. And I said like in the 27 years because actually democratic institutions in Mexico started developing decades ago, but it was like a slow, painful process that took or started to take shape in the 80s and then mostly in the 90s. That's when the PRI, started to lose ground, first in some local elections, state elections, state legislators, and then in 1997, the PRI lost the majority in Congress, federal Congress, and that was only 3 years before, in 2000, the presidency, PRI lost the presidency for the first time, and the 71 one-party rule ended at that time, and you know, in those years. Interestingly, those were also the years after the NAFTA, which is the predecessor of our current USMCA, started it entered in action in 1994. So it was also this sort of development, economic development, and sort of political development too. And what we saw after that was like, as I mentioned, a slow process of building democratic institutions, but also of containing the, putting checks and balances on the overwhelming power that the PRI had at all levels of government and all branches of government. So we started building like this strong electoral institutions, strong electoral courts, the autonomy of the central bank, the autonomy of the Census Bureau, and slowly taking, you know, steps. Of course, this is, as I say, a process. Maybe you take one step forward and then two steps backward or behind. But I think what we saw in the last quarter of a century was this slow building of democratic institutions, and also having them being cherished by the public and being cherished by the Mexican population. The PAN came along 2 terms, as you may remember, Vicente Fox, Felipe Calderón, and then the PRI came back with Enrique Peña Nieto. And basically the problems of Mexico were pretty much the same, increasing violence, corruption, the weakness of the rule of law. But as I said, we were slowly taking steps towards a better democratic framework and building. But this came, I think, to an end in 2018. What we had seen in those previous years from 2000, basically 1997, then 2000, and then to up to 2018, where what we call the divided governments. That means that the party that won the presidency, first the PAN and then PRI, didn't get the majorities, or at least the constitutional majorities in Congress. So those were the divided governments. Of course, the decisions are harder to make under the circumstances, but it was like the response of an electorate, you know, in the terms of not giving all the power again to one party or one person or one political group. But that came to an end in 2018 because the winner at that time was President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who took a large amount of triumphs at the local level, state level, and also at the Congress level. And sort of like the divided governments came to an end. The Morena, now his party, because he had previously run through the PRD, won largely. He was, I mean, overwhelmingly voted. But what started after that is in the opposite direction of what we were doing, sort of what started then was like this sort of slow return towards a more concentration of power in the executive branch, in the presidency of Mexico, and also at the Congress level, and basically trying to gain again those powers that the pre-presidency that we had overcome used to have. And that's where we are now, because we have seen this slow erosion of democratic institutions, slow democratic decline, I should say. And that is what is worrisome at this time of the elections. In the midterm elections of 2021, actually Morena lost the majorities that it had won in 2018. So we're back in sort of like, divided, so to speak, because they got enough the constitutional majorities in the House of Representatives, but they no longer have it in the Senate. So it's a little bit balanced, or you could say there was a shift in the support for Morena. Support for the president is still very high, and that's sort of like where we are right now, and what we're going to see about the very interesting results of the current polls. But what we have seen is this intention of eroding or taking back these prerogatives or rights or powers that were disseminated along the autonomous institutions, and that have been under attack. And that would be like the main issue for me at stake. And I would only mention three, and I would wrap up my introductory remarks. One would be the strength of the organized crime. That's something that we've been carrying along. I mentioned that the violence and has been particularly intense. We have not found the way of curbing down the homicides related to crime issues. And this has been, these 5 years of the López Obrador administration have been already the deadliest of all times in Mexico. So we have clearly not found a way to curb that. And now organized crime has also very much weight or gained weight in the elections. We saw that along these past years in the midterm elections, 2021, the local elections in the past couple of years. So that's a very important issue, and that is something that we have to reckon with and try to figure out how the organized crime is going to participate and in this electoral process. And the second one is the level of intervention from the president. He's weighing in this process, even though we have a very bizarre and baroque system of legal system for the elections, particularly in place because exactly of what the opposition and mainly the left-wing opposition led by President López Obrador were always trying to have more, very more restrictive legislation. That's what we have now. But the president is actually, failing to comply with those very restrictions that he wanted to be in the place for the previous elections. And then what I said is this capture or this erosion of the democratic institutions, particularly the electoral and judicial institutions, they have been under attack systematically every morning since the President López Obrador took office. We have incomplete institutions or captured institutions, starting by the INE, the electoral body, the federal electoral institution, and most importantly, the court, the electoral court. We have the Supreme Court, and we have like a Supreme Electoral Court, which decides on the electoral issues. That body is incomplete. The Senate hasn't been able to pass the new appointments. So we are heading for the largest election, the most important election, with incomplete and weakened bodies. And that, I think, would be an issue of the highest concern. So I would stop that. We can talk about the issues later on. particularly also in regards with the bilateral relationship with Mexico and the US, which is a very important one. But I would leave it there for my initial remarks and turn the mic back to you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Veronica. Great start. I'm going to turn it over now to Carlos. And Carlos, Vero kind of alluded to this. I mean, I wonder, one question that comes to mind is, to what extent do you think that this election is sort of a referendum on the Cuatro T, on the fourth transformation that López Obrador, the way he has described his political project? So love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so glad to be back at the Wilson Center and sharing this panel with very dear colleagues. So, well, to address your question, Head Start, I think that it is, I think the Obradorista coalition is trying to portray the election in many ways as a referendum on the so-called transformation. Even the official candidate, Claudia Sheinbaum, has very deliberately, placed in front of the electorate her dilemma, or her interpretation of what the dilemma of this election is, which is continuity or no, it's not backsliding. Continuidad o retroceso. So for them, it's clearly, it is in their interest. It's convenient for them to portray the election exactly as that. I think the opposition, particularly Xochitl Gálvez's campaign, is still struggling to define whether they want to become the anti-AMLO pole, or the, in a way being, the no alternative in that referendum, or I think they're struggling between being anti-AMLO or what I would call post-AMLO, which is, okay, the AMLO period is gone, whether you like it or not. He's not in the ballot. He's not going to be around anymore. So what comes next? What comes after, right? I don't think it's been well defined yet. I think they're still struggling in that regard. So, and to develop a bit this answer, let me talk about a bit where we are right now in the electoral process. I think that the first thing, important thing that has happened in the last months has been that AMLO finally chose and had her hair chosen very early and very openly. This is in stark contrast with presidential succession etiquette or trends, so to speak. We used to have the so-called tapado, which was the person that the president favored, and it was sort of a secret until very late in the game of presidential succession. And that has changed a lot. It was actually, the day after the midterms that it became clear that it was Claudia Sheinbaum who the president wanted. And it was not only that soon, but very open. That's interesting. And another important difference in that regard is that, López Obrador is the first president in the history of Mexican democracy, that is from 1997 on, who seems to have succeeded not only in having his favorite person become his party's candidate, but also in having this person become a competitive candidate to the point of being today the most likely winner. If we go back in time, we can see that Cedillo had, La Bastida be the candidate of the PRI, but he didn't win. It was Fox. Then Fox wanted Krill to be his successor, but he didn't. He lost even in appointing Krill as his party's candidate. It was Felipe Calderón. Then Felipe Calderón could not succeed to have his candidate, who was Cordero, in the ballot. And, regardless, the PAN lost. And then Peña succeeded, we could say, in having Meade in the ballot, but, Meade was not a competitive candidate, and AMLO won. Claudia Sheinbaum has succeeded in personifying the appetite for continuity that most voters seem to have at this point. She is AMLO's candidate, and she, at this point, she's most likely, the person posed to become the next president. I think that in terms of the issues, from the standpoint of the official coalition, the most important issue is the social programs and the so-called transformation agenda. And in terms of the challenges, I think that this idea of continuity is definitely a strength, but it also is a straitjacket for Claudia Sheinbaum because it prevents her from acknowledging, some of the bad results that the government has had and in proposing corrections to them. Truth be told, she doesn't need to. She's playing very defensively, and as soon as she protects her advantage, she is poised to win. But still, I mean, this straitjacket issue that I'm talking about might impact negatively, the way she's able to govern. In the opposition camp, what we have, after all, is we have a candidate. There was a lot of demoralization, a prevailing sensation of emptiness in the opposition camp because there was no one who could really, energize the opposition base and to bring together the opposition base that now is running with three parties that are used to, compete amongst each other. And, forget about the leaders for a second. If you think about the electorates of each of these parties, it is hard to bring them together and to tell them, now we're supporting the same candidate, we're together, when they have been, for many, many years competing with each other. So, it has to be said that Xochitl Gálvez really came to fill a void and to energize an opposition base that was really demoralized. But after she was able to insert herself very late in the game for the opposition's candidacy, in a matter of 90 days, she came from out of the blue to becoming the candidate. Then, she had to face a lot of trouble in terms of what the message was, of how to bring together all these parties, and also what to do with the discredit that these three traditional parties that are, she's running with have among the electorate. I mean, I'm sure Jorge and Alejandro will talk about this, but this is probably one of her most important weaknesses. On the one hand, she needs the parties. She needs the parties to make her their own, but at the same time, she needs to distance herself from them in order not to carry the negative baggage that they carry with the electorate. In terms of the issues, I think it is obvious that the issues she would, put forward most intensely are health, violence, and corruption. And her dilemma towards the electorate is, to move forward, or in Spanish, she's using, a little bit of a game of words here, es avanzar o claudicar, where, of course, claudicar means, giving up or being conformist. And finally, just a couple of words. There's a third candidate, Jorge Álvarez Maínez, who's the candidate of Movimiento Ciudadano, a party that had originally had another candidate, Samuel Garcia, the governor of Nuevo León, but he could not pull out of Nuevo León because it is the opposition that has the majority in Congress and that has the constitutional obligation to appoint whoever runs the governorship while he's away, and they were not willing to appoint somebody from his own party or somebody that he agreed with. And in the end, he said, I cannot abandon Nuevo León to these forces, so I'm going to step back in. And he abandoned, his party in the presidential race. Now they have appointed somebody else, Jorge Álvarez Maínez, who's very young and who still has two very important differences with the other two candidates. Number one, he's very young. He's 38. Both Xochitl and Claudia are above 60. And number two, he's going to be the only man in the race. And apparently, our pollsters can tell us more about this. There is an electorate, not a majoritarian electorate, but there is an electorate for whom voting for a man might be an attractive option. And that's what Movimiento Ciudadano is, trying to hit at. Although, the thing is, this new candidate is going to have to clean up the mess that Samuel left and prove himself to be capable of heading the so-called third option, of breaking the pro-AMLO or anti-AMLO alignment that the political spectrum has adopted. To close, I wanted to say a couple of more words about what Verónica was already describing about the electoral authorities having being weakened, by the appointment of loyalists, of government loyalists in key positions, by the removal of independent officials from key positions, by the delay in the appointment of new officials, because of the reduction of their budgets in an electoral year, and because of a constant and frankly unjustified attacks from the president and his coalition. All of this is pushing us towards a situation in which we seem to be heading to an election that in a way is turning the very definition of democracy around. Adam Przeworski coined this classical definition of democracy as being uncertainty regarding electoral results, but certainty regarding institutional procedures. Nowadays in Mexico, we seem to be creating an opposite scenario, increasing certainty regarding who's going to win, and increasing uncertainty regarding the integrity of institutional procedures.
Thank you. That's a great summary. I think I appreciate the way you and Veronica really framed the issues and pointed out both sort of the pros and cons of the main candidates. And that's a good lead-in, I think, to our two pollsters who can share some data with us to give us a sense of how that really plays out. So we're going to start with you, Jorge, and I know you have some interesting data about voter segmentation. So we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you to the Wilson Center for the invitation. I like to start putting this election in context. I really like the term Carlos used of the etiquette of presidential successions. And I probably would start saying that it seems there's no etiquette anymore. And by that, I mean the president is still in the spotlight. The president is still taking major decisions that will probably constrain the next government. And for what we saw in the election of a Morena candidate in the Mexico City government, it seems that that the president really loves to still confirm that he's the boss, that he's the one taking decisions. And this is completely in contrast to what happened in the past, where you had the president withdrawing from the public spotlight, taking the candidates the center stage. And nowadays, the candidates have to fight for media coverage. You just have to see the Mexican media, all the coverage they give to the president. So one consequence of this, and I agree with you, Andrew, that it seems that the focus is in framing this election as a referendum on López Obrador and the 4T project. He continues talks about it. So the big question here is, we know candidates matter in an election, but the key question is, will it be the main driving force behind voters' choice, or will partisan identities where Morena have a big advantage over PAN, PRI, and PRD will be the main factor, or presidential approval will matter most? These are endogenous variables, but it makes a lot of difference if candidates matter more than partisan identities, because if partisan identities matter more, then we will have more stability in the next few months. And if candidates matter more, then we will expect to see more changes in public opinion. This being said, because we are less than 5 months into the day of the election, and still a conservative estimate, I mean, we could say that about 40% of the Mexican population do not know even the most basic form of information, the name recognition, do not know about Sheinbaum or Xochitl Gálvez. And this is particularly important for Xochitl Gálvez, that at this point, she splits opinion among the Mexican public. She has more or less the same level of positive opinions and negative opinions. But if she manages to move public opinion and to put it on a positive side and something that benefits her, then we will expect public opinion to shift a little bit to make this election more competitive. Because a frequent question that we get is that is this an election that whose outcome is still undecided, that Xochitl can win, and of course she might, but I do not recall an election where 5 months before the day of the election there is such a big advantage of at least 20 percentage points between the first and the second place. In the past, we have seen movements in polls, and of course, the 2006 election is a classic example that we had Calderon reversing a 10-point disadvantage and winning the election. But we are talking about more than 20 percentage points, at least at this time. So it really matters that this election is framed more as a candidate-based election than a partisan-based election, because that's the best way for Xochitl Gálvez to be to make this a competitive race. And so, but here what it will be very important is that she can frame the issue more about her than about López Obrador and the continuity of the 4T or the 4T, because as Democrats, George Lakoff books explains, don't speak about an elephant. Here, the thing is that if you begin to talk and to criticize López Obrador, then you will obviously make this election more about a referendum on the 4T. And this will probably play to the advantage. So these are more or less the overall issues that we'll probably see taking place in the following months. But I think that we have to watch closely what happens with the presidential behavior, because if he continues to be in the spotlight, it's going to be very difficult for either Sheinbaum or Xochitl Gálvez to take center stage, and then it's going to be a different game than in the past. And I will wrap it up there.
Jorge, thank you. That great continuation of the prior comments. I think are really interesting. That distinction between is it about the party or the candidate is an important thing for us to think about. So now for our last opening comments, Alejandro, we'll turn to you. You've released through El Financiero some polling numbers, so maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what Jorge was just alluding to, about how much movement might there be in the polls over the next 4.5 months.
So just something real quick. I've seen some polls. I'm not sure if there were polls by Jorge or Alejandro. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But I've seen some polls asking people that, you know, openly, directly the question, have you decided who to vote? And I am under the impression that the percentage of people saying yes is unusually high in this electoral cycle, but I'm not certain of that. I don't know how high it was before in other electoral cycles. So I wanted to ask them, how useful is asking that question at this point in the electoral process? I know it's not exactly the same, but more or less, I've seen in both of your polls that, you know, voters who seem to be very sure. In Alejandro's polls, they're called committed. And in Jorge's poll, they're called openly frentistas and morenistas. So, but my question is this: how much do this percentage of people who seem to have been to be already decided or to be very short, compares with previous electoral cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And see, Alejandro, did we get you back?
Can you hear me there?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, I'm sorry about that. Always technical difficulties. But let me get back to your question. Is this a referendum style election? And I was saying, let me go further, maybe stretch the concept a little further. And it feels, Andrew, that this is more like a re-election bid by López Obrador. Everybody knows here that he cannot be re-elected. The election laws don't allow that, but it feels like a re-election bid. And when you listen to the president announcing 10 constitutional reforms at the start of the campaigns, this is going to be about him. This is going to be about his government. And the discussion, the public discussion about 10 constitutional reforms, whether they are approved or not, perhaps it's not that it's not important, but it's secondary for the campaign. It will center on what the president wants the electorate to hear. It's going to overshadow the two main candidates or the three candidates, whoever it is there. I think this feels like a re-election bid. In that sense, it breaks away with every presidential etiquette that Carlos was referring to. We are witnessing a new kind of presidential election. It's not 2018, and it is not the referendum type of 2021. I can return to that if there is a chance, but I think this very much feels like a re-election bid without the possibility of re-election, of course, because this is going to be AMLO-centric. This is going to be López Obrador-centric. Now, how much can preferences change? I will return to the specific numbers, but let me give a little bit of context too on what the polls have told us in the last 30 or 40 years of presidential elections, competitive presidential elections. One big phenomena is that a majority of voters, a growing majority of voters, is not attached to the political parties. We have gone through a process of partisan realignment that has made a majority of voters not attached with any partisan loyalty to any of the options. This creates more volatility, more uncertainty, less partisan vote, and I think that that's something to consider. Of course, the rise of Morenismo has somehow stopped the decline of partisanship in Mexico. It has continued with the traditional parties, PAN, PRI, and PRT, who keep losing and bleeding partisans by the week. But Morenistas have stopped it. But the thing there is that it's not really partisanship in the traditional sense of party reference, but it's mostly Obradoristas. The loyalty is towards President López Obrador. Between 2/3 and 3/4 of those voters who say they are Morenistas, on a follow-up question in the polls, they're actually López Obradoristas. So that's something to take into account. It seems that for the growing electorate that is non-partisan, this is not only a re-election bid election, but it's an election between the lesser evil. And we're seeing in social media this message now that perhaps Xochitl is not 100% of what I want, but Claudia Sheinbaum is 100% of what I don't want. And you can see the logic of choosing between the two, between the lesser evils. And I will return to MC later if there's chance, but I think this is something very interesting. There is an increasing partisan and political polarization. The fewer partisans that are left in the electorate, including the very active ones in social media, are much more passionate than before. And this is something that is going to put the particular tone in this presidential election, I think, in ways that we haven't seen before. Not even in 2006, that was a very polarized election. So I may be wrong about that, but I would expect a high level of polarization. And the third thing that I've documented with polls over the years and in different academic publications is this concept that I originally called the internetization of politics, which is obviously the digitalization and the social media. We have a new generation of digital age voters. Just to give you the numbers from INE, and I will be very brief. 4 million have 18 or 19 years old, 11 million, 20 to 24, another 11 million, 25 to 29 years old. 16 million voters, 26 million voters under 30. This is the digital age kind of electorate that we know very little about. So this is going to be also very interesting. Politicians are turning, including the president, who already opened his platform of TikTok to talk to the youth. And again, I think in favor of my not legal, but at least impressionistic idea that this is a re-election bid, we're going to see a digital campaign in very interesting ways. Things that will not like these voters, things that will impress these voters. And I think this is something to pay attention to, because we're going to see, or we're seeing, new ways of political communication. What are the advantages? They're going to be brief, like the president says in TikTok. They're going to be maybe not very substantial, and they may prioritize image. We're going to see an image-centered campaign in which proposals, in which policy proposals perhaps will be secondary, and especially because the president is announcing 10 reforms, as I mentioned before. On February 5th, which is the day of the Constitution, we will know more about this, but who knows what the tone of the campaign is going to be when the president is the center of it all. I'm going to leave it there for time, but I will return to the data that we're collecting and trying to make sense of this. I just wanted to give a more general sense of how the electorate has changed in these 30 years and how the parties in the opposition are struggling so much. They're still bleeding followers, and why the non-partisan electorate, which has been anti-traditional parties, still remains anti-traditional parties, but has some sense of disappointment with the 4T. So it's going to be interesting, finally, towards which side they swing.
Thanks, Alejandro. And that actually raises, I think, a point that I'll pose a question I think that all the panelists can respond to, connected to that question of the younger voters, the 26 million. So that's what, about 25%, 25% of the whole electorate.
It's 97, 98 million, depending on the final, but just more. Yep. Roughly 100 million voters, yeah.
And it seems that the Movimiento Ciudadano is sort of aiming at that cohort in their approach, in their candidate's choice, and in the way that they announce the candidate. So that sort of prompts in my mind, and maybe the panelists, Vero is shaking her head. Maybe we could talk a little bit about what do we expect from the Movimiento Ciudadano? How much of an impact will they have, and upon whom? So Veronica, do you want to start?
I'll talk about Movimiento Ciudadano, but I would also like to leave a question now that you asked our pollsters, Jorge and Alejandro, mentioning about the trends in poll recent. I would ask them also if we can see a trend in overestimating the incumbent party, or the Morena, actually, and in recent elections, because we have seen that. And I'm thinking about this difference in polls, the range that was also the advantage that was mentioned, Jorge was mentioning. Some polls have a 30-point advantage. Some others have like a lower 10, 12. And so of course, maybe the response is somewhere in between, but I think because of the disappointment that Alejandro was mentioning, I would consider that maybe there's a slight overestimation, and maybe what we call the voto oculto, or something that the people are not answering, or answering politically correct answers when you ask them about their voting preferences or intentions. I wanted to just leave that question about how do we analyze this the gap in the polls, in the current polls, and I just wanted to make a comment. Movimiento Ciudadano, as Carlos mentioned, I don't think they will recover from the mess that was the failed candidacy of Nuevo León's governor. And I think the disadvantage of Jorge Álvarez Maínez, who's a good politician, very young, as Carlos mentioned. I don't know if he has the time to be known in the wider spectrum in all the country, because time is running off, and the purpose of the Movimiento Ciudadano candidacy, I think, was clearly to convince those young voters, the 26 million that are under 30 years old, and that would go to the social media, basically, because Samuel Garcia and his wife, that are very, very, they have a very strong position in terms of social media, and they were, they're very known, and they were appealing to that segment precisely. I don't know if Álvarez Maínez can, replicate that the popularity of Samuel Garcia and Mariana, his wife. So that remains to be seen. But I think clearly the target was this segment of young people that are not seduced by the parties, that are definitely not seduced by Morena or by PRI, PAN, and that would mean some points of advantage particularly for Morena, for Claudia Sheinbaum, if those young voters were to decide to vote or to divide the opposition vote. And actually, Luis Donaldo Colosio, who is a member of the Movimiento Ciudadano, clearly stated that although his name was very known and he appeared on top of the previous polls, he said that he was not going to divide the opposition, which clearly showed what the intention of a candidacy of Movimiento Ciudadano was intended for. So I think that remains to be seen. And my last point that I would make is that what Alejandro said, that this whole election feels more like a re-election bid, that sends chills through our spines, because I think that's exactly what voters at least over 30 don't want to go back to. And that's the problem, that sentiment is something that we cannot easily convey to the younger generations, that that didn't have what the previous overwhelming rule of one party, the PRI, 71 years, meant in terms of democratic freedoms, in terms of political rights and everything. So that's exactly where I think that's the issue at stake, for the opposition to frame this election more than it is the lesser evil, or to choosing between the lesser evil. Maybe you don't like PRI, PAN, PRD, maybe you don't even like Xochitl Gálvez, but this is between, there are only two choices, either democracy or autocracy or even dictatorship. So you have to frame it that way. And the challenge for Morena, which is not easy, because exactly what I was saying, how the president is weighing in, and it's about him, and it has always been about him, and it will continue, because exactly what he's trying to do is to steal the stage and be all about him, now defending his proposed reforms, and how to translate his popularity without his negatives, because his administration has negatives. He is very popular, he as an individual, but once you go down to evaluate or to see the government and the issues like insecurity, like crime, like health, like education, then the approval is not that high. But how to translate his popularity into Claudia and see it like a whole, this continuous with no breaks in between. So I think that's a challenge on the side of Morena, but the stakes are very high.
Thanks, Veronica. Veronica asked a question, I guess, sort of about are the polls overestimating Morena's strength, or I suppose the other way to put it is it actually closer than it appears? Or maybe do you think, is it likely, and Alejandro, you as well, is it likely to get closer as the election?
I think there is an overestimation of Morena. We saw it in 2021, about 6 percentage points on average, and but still, I mean, the average now, the advantage of Claudia Sheinbaum, it's about 28, 30 percentage points on average on the face-to-face service and some telephone polls. So even if you take this overestimation, it's still a very big advantage. All this being said, I think there are ways to deal with the overestimation. I mean, there are models that can be used by pollsters that are used either in Mexico or in some other parts of the world to deal with this kind of stuff. And whether it is weighting by past election results or using classification techniques based on machine learning. So there are ways to deal with this. So hopefully many pollsters will use some kind of these methods in order to overcome the overestimation of results. And given that we all are more or less agreeing that this is going to be a referendum election or a re-election bid, as Alejandro was saying, or continuity versus not change. I think that a question that comes to mind is that we will see a negative campaign against López Obrador, because it is a perfect playground for a negative campaign, especially on security, where violence is really extended. The economy is doing well, but when you are stressing continuity, I mean, negative campaigns, I mean, that's where most of the attention is focused on all the things that went wrong when you were a government. And we must not forget that it is more or less clear to assign political responsibility in Mexico nowadays, because Morena has the federal government, state governments, and municipal governments. So it is vulnerable to attacks that emphasize that the Morena governments are not giving results in some areas. And we should expect that. We have seen it in the past, that this can move public opinion.
Thanks. Alejandro, did you want to add anything on the polling question?
Yes, very briefly. I think that when we look at the history of polling in our country, 30, 40 years now, since the 1980s, there has always been an overestimation of the government party, whether it was the PRI or the PAN or now Morena. The interesting thing is how, once the campaign starts, those preferences may change. And the last two federal elections, 2018 and 2021, have had big swings on preferences. If we take the polls as our criteria, not the previous election, but the polls, and they have done so in opposite ways. In 2018, López Obrador began in the low 30s and finished in the mid 50s. So it was a huge growth that no one really expected. So it moved a lot. And in 2021, the early polls showed a very big advantage for Morena that ended up basically in a statistical tie, 42-40 between them and opposition or something like that. So opposite directions, and one of them, the Morena support went down in 2021. In another one, it went skyrocketing to levels we didn't imagine. And I think the question now is not whether we are overestimating. I think that there may be some spiral of silence effect, some kind of political correct responses, but there is also a a regular use of polls as a propaganda technique. So many of the numbers we see are plain propaganda. I would say that. So this is not the response of voters. This is just what it's functional to the parties. And this happens in lots of places in the world. That's why it's important to have transparency, who pays for the polls, and so on and so forth. But I think that not everything is attributed to the voters and their voters' responses. It's a strategic instrument for campaigning that is valid in democracies, but it needs transparency. So having said that, the question is this going to be closer to what 2018 was? I mean, the leading candidate just grows and grows, and we are going to end up seeing Claudia effectively in 60 or 70% of the vote? Or is it going to be more like 2021, where Morena started really high, but as the election closed, preferences kind of balanced a little bit more? The truth is we don't know. And I think because the president has announced 10 constitutional reforms, they don't seem very confident in their numbers. They have to mobilize public sentiment around the goodness of the policy of López Obrador and the 4T for the electorate, and frame it in a way that the electorate sees that the president wants the best for the people. I mean, our generation, perhaps some of us, perhaps Verónica, are looking specifically at the attack at institutions because they're democratic institutions, but some segments of the electorate are seeing a legitimate attack at corrupt neoliberal institutions. So the framing matters here. And of course, Vero and I, who belong to the same generation of democratic aspirers, look at this in a certain way, but the president has been very effective in putting this in different ways. These reforms are for the people, are for the good of the people, and those who block them need to get out of office. We need to redistribute power. So this is going to be interesting. Again, I probably broke every etiquette here that Carlos was calling for, but again, this is going to center around what President López Obrador wants for the future of Mexico, whether it's he in the office, which he cannot, or whether it's the 4T in the person of Claudia Sheinbaum in the presidency, but also many other representatives in Congress and many other governors. There are 9 governorship races, which are going to be very interesting. So again, I think this is going to be important, and I don't want to with this, having said this, I don't want to diminish the importance of public opinion polling by saying that much of it can be propagandistic, but we have to recognize there is that possibility. Now, I don't think it's going to be 2018. I don't think it's going to be 2021. We have to understand the dynamics of what is going to happen here. One possibility is that maybe preferences will simply don't change. They're so polarized now that even though we have a large non-partisan electorate that I argued is uncertain and it's volatile, it's also very anti-PRI and anti-PAN, and it's disappointed. And it doesn't mean it has to go the third way because, Movimiento Ciudadano may be attracted to some niches, some parts of the electorate, especially younger ones, who, by the way, I think this is also perhaps at this stage, well, let's see how it works in the next months, but Movimiento Ciudadano support in the polls may be also overestimated because many of the younger people are less likely to vote. So this is a question of whether they're going to be mobilized. These 26 million, which are about 27 or 28% of the total electorate, tend to vote less than the rest of the electorate. Now, López Obrador and his party's movement, I will finish with this, has larger support among the older voters, 50 plus, but it has a decent support among the younger voters. I stopped belonging to the middle category, unfortunately, but those between 30 and 50 are the ones who seem to be less Obradoristas, less enthusiastic with López Obrador and the 4T, and that's where, the battle can be, but they're also not so enthusiastic about the opposition. So we will see how this works.
Great, thank you. I want to shift gears a little bit. We don't have a lot of time left, unfortunately. I will mention if those of you watching, if you want to pose a question, you can email it to mexico@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tag us on formerly Twitter at Mexico Institute. But let me shift gears just a little bit. Because the two main candidates are both women, it is pretty clear that Mexico is going to elect its first female president ever. Mexico continues to confront alarming rates of femicide, with 10 women murdered every day, continuing challenges in the lack of reporting of femicides, high rates of impunity, etc. So I wonder, and I welcome the comments of any of you on the panel, should we expect a change in the way gender-based violence is addressed with a female chief executive? And to what extent do you think the fact that, and Carlos, you alluded to this a little bit, so maybe we could start with you, to the question of are Mexicans comfortable voting for a female president? Or so basically sort of how might gender and gender-based violence play into this election and then to the outcome? Carlos, can I start with you?
Yes, sure. Well, both Claudia Sheinbaum and Xochitl Gálvez have made, an issue about the fact that, in the next term, there's going to be, for the first time in Mexican history, a woman president. But I don't think any of them have really, stood out in terms of having, really a gender agenda. None of them are really part of the feminist movement in any significant way. Claudia Sheinbaum, well, has been, in leftist circles all her life. And Xochitl Gálvez was a strange kind of panista, although she's not actually a member of the party, but all her political career she's been, she has done in the PAN, because she's pro-choice. And, she's not your average panista in terms of her positions. She's a bit more center-left than center-right. I think that actually that's one of the reasons why she was chosen in the first place. There's been a shift in what sociologists call the Overton window. And I think the opposition realized early on that they could not nominate a traditional politician, and they ended up choosing Xochitl precisely because of that. But apart from that, I haven't seen any of them really embrace a much more deliberate or much more aggressive feminist agenda, or gender, or public policies with a gender perspective, so to speak. I think Claudia is not going to want to talk about violence in general, not only violence against women, because it's clearly an issue in which she has very little to win, since it's one of the issues in which the government she represents the continuity of is more vulnerable. I think Xochitl Gálvez might try to push that issue into the debate. I don't know how successful, because with the majority of the electorate being more or less, at this point at least, favoring Obrador, well, favoring the continuity of Obrador in the person of Claudia, for them, it's very easy to deflect the issue of violence, alluding to the fact that it comes from before, that this is all, Felipe Calderón's failure that has, somehow carried on through the years. So I think there might be an opening there, because this is probably the issue where the government, the opposite of the government, is worst in terms of public opinion. But I would be reluctant to think that it's clear and open and it's going to happen that way. And just to address a couple of issues that came up, I think that Alejandro was saying there might be some sort of pro-incumbent bias or pro-Morena bias, but it's not really a matter of big concern. But I think there is a thing that should be a matter of concern, which is the pro-incumbent politics that we're seeing from the government. In the opposition, they're calling this elección de Estado, which they have a point. There's very little transparency in terms of public expenditure right now. there's a lot of news being made about corruption, about deviation of resources, and I think that might actually be influencing what pollsters are picking up. It might not necessarily be a pro-incumbent bias in the polls themselves, but there might be a pro-incumbent bias in the way the government is actually using its power and its resources to favor Claudia Sheinbaum. That is something that I think, Verónica was touching upon this a bit, but I think it should be said this explicitly, because this really puts into jeopardy, the integrity of the electoral process, and how is this going to be really a free and fair election? It might be free. We have seen this before in a lot of countries that have the same problem of democratic backsliding. Elections might be free, but they don't seem to be, heading towards fair. And I think that's very important to say. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And
Veronica, please go ahead.
Yeah, if I can add on the women's issue and the gender issue, I think the irony of this is that Claudia Sheinbaum has belonged to the leftist movement all her life, as Carlos was mentioning. But the irony of this is when she was mayor in Mexico City, well, she didn't have a particularly good relationship even with the feminist movements. Her attorney general conducted very dubious inquiries and an agenda on women, and even she used the police forces, the armed forces, in a very harsh way in women's demonstrations and feminist movements. So she was not an ally for the feminist movement, particularly when you are saying, and rightly so, that we have this very high rate of femicides and of violence in general. As I was mentioning, this being already the deadliest period in Mexico's history. So I think it's ironic, and I agree with Carlos that with such record, and with such record on her tenure as a Mexico City's mayor, and with the record of violence in the overall administration, I think they are going to try to sidetrack the violence issue altogether. And also because being a leftist, politician, she also sort of mimetized with the president, who is very conservative when it comes to social issues and social liberties, very, very conservative. So whether she was pro-choice or more progressive left, politician, well, that didn't come up, because she would always, as she is doing right now, mimetize and mimic and replicate what the president is doing. So I think that's the irony of this. And so giving more space in that sense to Xochitl, who has been more straightforward and even campaigning for the PAN, but saying and stating that she personally is pro-choice. And so she's, she has been more open and more transparent in her choices. So I wanted to make that comment on what you asked. Mm-hmm.
Really helpful. Thank you, Veronica. We're getting close to the end. We got a question from our audience, I think maybe is a fitting way to wrap up. So give you each a chance, just maybe 1 or 2 minutes at the most, to respond to this. The question is pointing out that today is the end of the pre-campaign period. So the question is whether the panelists think that any candidate came out stronger at the end of the process. So maybe sort of handicap where they were, say 3 months ago, 4 months ago, and where they are today. And Veronica, maybe we'll start with you. We'll just go in the same order that we did to open up.
Yeah, I think we saw a change, I think favorable to Xochitl Gálvez in the end. She made her final pre-campaña event last Sunday, and it got very broad coverage in the social media, not in the traditional media, who have been, also dubious to follow her and to cover her. But I think we saw again like this fresh candidate like Xochitl again, and distancing herself, what the margin that she has from the parties, and showing up for her, or standing up for her own ideas. And I think that was refreshing, and I think it ended. The Claudia's final event is today, this afternoon, so we'll still have to see. But I think in terms of the public opinion, we will see that Xochitl ended in better terms. And I would just end by saying, I mean, as a woman, this should be a very good news to have a first woman president of Mexico. But my fear is that if it comes at the price of a democratic decline, or even like a mimic of a re-election, that will be a very, very high price to pay, and we wouldn't want to see that.
Great. Thank you. Carlos, and any thoughts on the pre-campaign, or whether it, how it might have changed perspectives or opinions?
I am under the impression that the movements we've seen are almost within the margin of error. I am under the impression that this so-called pre-campaign period, which is a legal fiction. I mean, candidates have been campaigning since many months ago, and they will continue to campaign one way or another during this so-called inter-campaigns period. But well, just to answer the question, I am under the impression they have been very stable, that the pre-campaign season didn't make much difference, except in the case of Movimiento Ciudadano, that had this moment that seemed to be growing, although I still have to see the numbers of that. There is, the anecdotal evidence, so to speak, that Samuel Garcia was growing, but I still have to see a poll that really substantiates this claim. It might be true because his campaign was very aggressive, and I think was very good in terms particular of its, of the image, of the portrayal of the candidate as young, as energized, as charismatic. But apart from that, I haven't seen any poll that really substantiates that. But as I was saying, I think it's been stable. A bit, in my impression, Claudia Sheinbaum has grown a bit during that period, but it's still very small within the margin of error. And Xochitl has remained pretty much the same or within the margin of error. But I mean, of course, the pollsters will have more information on that. I think the impression overall at the beginning was that Xochitl was disappointing. There was an expectation that she would grow more than she did. She didn't. And by the end, in her closing event, she gave a very good discourse, a really, really very good discourse, which has sort of created the perception that she's, on the up and up again. But still, again, I have to see a poll that substantiates that claim.
Great. Well, let's turn to our two pollsters to wrap up and see. We'll start with you, Jorge, if you have any thoughts on what you saw in the
in terms of polling numbers, I think that things didn't change that much. Probably if we compare with August before the nominating process, it seems that Sheinbaum got a good deal of positive coverage because of the nominating process. On the other hand, Xochitl got a lot of name recognition, but she got also a lot of negatives because the president criticized her a lot. So the way that she was getting to be known was not the best way. But we must remember that the electoral legislation is very restrictive. So we do not have a standard campaign going on in the past few months. So that explains a lot of the stability. And also, I want to wrap it up with this. If you compare the last 3 years, the generic party vote for the presidency has been really stable. It hasn't changed that much. And this is something completely different to what we saw in the period between 2015, 2017, 18, that you had López Obrador growing growing up a lot and the decline of the PRI. So, but I agree with Carlos. There's a lot of stability right now, or there was a lot of stability in polling numbers.
Great, thanks. And Alejandro, over to you.
Thank you. I think it's a way, a very nice way to put it, the end of the pre-campaign. What's the balance? What the corte de cajas, we say in Spanish. I'm not sure what the term for that in English is, but what's the balance at the end of this strange period of pre-campaign in our election laws, in which they're sort of closing the campaign to the partisans? Now, on March 1st, they will open it to the electorate in general. And I think looking at the past elections, movements and preferences begin actually February, March, April. In 2000, we saw that things started to move until March, April. Same thing in 2012. And 2018 was an exception because while PAN and PRI candidates were still struggling for who was the second place, López Obrador was just going away and away. But it was also February, March. So expecting big changes in voting intentions at this point historically doesn't hold. And the polls now, the current polls don't show also many changes. I think that Carlos is correct when he says whatever variations there within margin of error. When it comes to voting intentions, as a matter of fact, what I'm talking about here, we have published it in El Financiero. We have delivered the proper reports to the INE so everyone can see them. Even though I'm not touching at the numbers particularly, I think that may be redundant, but something that has changed dramatically, and I say dramatically with care, knowing that we don't know how dramatic we can be in elections, but the negatives for the two candidates have grown impressively. Xochitl Gálvez began as a maverick outsider coming to the possibility of being and I'm going to use this word carefully, but because it was used by analysts, the messiah, the expected messiah for the opposition who would change everything. And it seemed to have momentum when she was nominated, but then nothing happened except her negatives grew up. Jorge agrees with that. It seems that his data also show this, but he attributes that negativity to López Obrador's attacks. I think those attacks are in the past. We haven't seen really anything more recent, but the negativity keeps growing. I think that in addition to the attacks by the president, we have to acknowledge that she is inheriting the bad press, the bad reputation of the traditional parties. Now the weight of the bad image of the PRI and the PAN among many voters are a burden for Xochitl Gálvez. And she and her campaign are going to have to take that into account because it's a handicap. But just to give you a rough number, when she was nominated, she had around 30% of negative opinion. Now it's over 50%, going on to 60. So this is not a minor change. Voting intentions have not changed, but the image of the candidates have changed. And Claudia Sheinbaum has varied within a range of, she has more positive than negatives, but the negative image has also grown over the months. And again, I think that they have detected this in the campaign headquarters in the National Palace. And that's why I think the president is going to make this more AMLO-centric. This is not to talk with disdain about the candidate. I think we're looking forward to see these candidates debating and discussing and deliberating. But I think that the president is going to take, as I've said, center stage, and the voters are going to respond to that too. So there have been changes, and in other things, the most important, the horse race question, no change at all.
Great, thank you, Alejandro. And I think one takeaway that you've all alluded to is it sort of stems from one of the first questions I posed is how much of this is a referendum on AMLO, and as you said, it in many ways feels like a re-election. So it will certainly, as is always the case, be interesting to see the role that that López Obrador continues to play in the political discourse, in the media coverage in Mexico and here in the United States. I want to thank our panelists for kicking off our series. Fantastic conversation. Appreciate everybody who watched online. We hope that it was informative and useful to all of you too. And please stay tuned for subsequent events. And again, thank you to the panelists and to everybody who watched.
Thank you for having us.